In 1973, Bruce Lee died suddenly. The coroner's court later ruled his death as death by misadventure, with the official medical conclusion stating that the cause was cerebral edema. However, beyond this medical determination, another narrative began circulating, one that has persisted in the public consciousness for more than half a century. It was not based on evidence, nor on official documentation, but on deeply stigmatizing rumors, excessive sexual activity, aphrodisiacs, even the so-called notion of death during intercourse. Over time, these claims were repeatedly cited, amplified, and sensationalized, gradually displacing medical discussion altogether. They became the most enduring and most distorted public image of Bruce Lee's death. Yet the discussion surrounding Bruce Lee's death extends far beyond rumor. Over the past 5 decades, medical records, witness testimonies, autopsy findings, and later medical research have all existed, but rarely examined together within a single framework. This video does not seek to revive conspiracy theories or overturn the coroner's ruling. Instead, it brings together contemporary medical records, the first-hand account of the emergency physician, family medical history, overseas forensic reports, and modern medical analysis, and re-examines them through today's medical understanding. By doing so, it aims to reassess the mystery of Bruce Lee's death and question whether he ever deserved the accusations and stigma that have followed him for decades. Before moving into the analysis, it is necessary to briefly outline the sequence of events on the day of Bruce Lee's death. On the afternoon of July 20th, 1973, Bruce Lee went to the Kowloon apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei to discuss the script for the film Game of Death. At approximately 7 p.m., Bruce Lee complained of a headache. Betty Ting Pei gave him a single painkiller, which he took before going into the bedroom to rest. As night fell, Bruce Lee did not wake up. Sometime after 9 p.m., Betty Ting Pei attempted to rouse him but received no response. At that point, an ambulance was not immediately called. Instead, a private physician was contacted in an attempt to seek assistance. Only after it became clear that the situation was critical was Bruce Lee transported to the emergency department of Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Upon arrival, medical staff immediately took over and initiated emergency resuscitation procedures. Multiple doctors were involved, and prolonged efforts were made to revive him. Despite these extensive measures, his life could not be saved. The physician who truly took over the emergency resuscitation that night was, in fact, far from an anonymous figure. His name is Dr. Mok Hoi Hung. In 1973, Dr. Mok was on duty in the Accident and Emergency Department at Queen Elizabeth Hospital and was one of the doctors directly involved in the resuscitation of Bruce Lee. Afterward, he was required to formally confirm the death, sign the relevant documentation, and later personally participate in the autopsy procedure. Many years later, Dr. Mok rarely agreed to give a television interview. In a special feature produced by Television Broadcasts Limited, TVB, he provided one of the most complete public accounts of the emergency treatment and subsequent autopsy. In the interview, Dr. Mack stated clearly that by the time Bruce Lee arrived at the emergency department, he had already lost spontaneous breathing, heartbeat, and pulse. Even so, medical staff proceeded according to emergency protocols, continuing cardiopulmonary resuscitation and administering medications in the hope that there might still be a chance of revival. Under normal circumstances, if there is no response after 10 to 15 minutes of resuscitation, efforts are typically discontinued. However, Dr. Mack recalled that the resuscitation that night lasted nearly 30 minutes. He explained that the guiding principle at the time was simple. As long as death had not been formally declared, the patient had to be treated as if there was still hope. Ultimately, the resuscitation was unsuccessful. As one of the last physicians to take over the case that night, Dr. Mack was responsible for signing the death certificate and formally confirming Bruce Lee's passing. It was also because of this role that he later took part in the autopsy and personally observed the condition of Bruce Lee's body. In the TVB interview, Dr. Mack also acknowledged candidly that one of the key factors affecting his initial medical assessment that night was the fact that the clinical information he received was incomplete. He recalled that while speaking with family members outside the emergency room, the head of Golden Harvest, Raymond Chow, proactively provided an account of Bruce Lee's condition. Chow stated that Bruce Lee had been sent to the hospital from home and that he had collapsed after suddenly crying out about a severe headache. Based on Dr. Mack's training and experience at the time, such a description naturally pointed toward the possibility of an acute cerebral hemorrhage in a young, physically robust individual. Dr. Mack later reflected that, at that stage of his career, he was relatively junior and placed almost complete trust in the information provided by the patient's family. He therefore made his preliminary medical judgment based on that understanding. Only in hindsight did he realize that these key details were inconsistent with the accounts that later emerged during the coroner's court proceedings. More critically, no one informed him that earlier that same year, in May, Bruce Lee had suffered a severe medical episode. While working on set, Bruce Lee had suddenly vomited, experienced convulsions, and lost consciousness, and was rushed to hospital in a condition that was at one point life-threatening. This medical history would have been highly relevant to understanding the cause of his sudden death in July. Yet at the time of the emergency room assessment, Dr. Mack was completely unaware of it. Dr. Mack stated plainly that had he known about this prior episode, his approach to both resuscitation and the assessment of death would inevitably have taken a different direction. However, given the incomplete information available to him that night, he could only base his judgment on what he saw and what he was told, and arrive at what he believed to be the most reasonable conclusion at the time. What ultimately altered his understanding came several days later in the autopsy room. During the autopsy, when examining the brain, Dr. Mack encountered a finding that was entirely inconsistent with his initial diagnosis. There was no evidence of intracranial bleeding. This discovery led him to recognize that the cause of Bruce Lee's death was far more complex than what could be inferred at the emergency room stage. Because the initial assessment made in the emergency room was later corrected, Dr. Mack subsequently addressed several long-circulating claims with exceptional clarity and directness. In the TVB interview, he noted that following Bruce Lee's death, widespread speculation quickly emerged within society. Among these were deeply stigmatizing narratives, including claims of death caused by excessive sexual activity, the use of aphrodisiacs, or so-called death during intercourse. Over time, these ideas were repeatedly circulated and gradually packaged as seemingly plausible explanations. From a medical standpoint, however, they lacked any substantive basis. Dr. Mack explained that if a person were to die suddenly during sexual activity, or as a result of drugs associated with such activity, corresponding pathological signs would typically be found during autopsy, most commonly within the cardiovascular system or the brain. In Bruce Lee's case, no such evidence was found. Throughout the entire process, the detail that left the deepest impression on Dr. Mack was not any rumor, but the physical condition of Bruce Lee's body as observed in the autopsy room. He described a physique with exceptionally well-defined musculature and clear anatomical structure, almost like an illustration from a medical textbook, reflecting the condition of a man who had undergone long-term physical training, with none of the abnormalities suggested by external speculation. It was precisely because he had seen this firsthand that Dr. Mack felt confident stating that Bruce Lee should not be defined by crude or sensationalized imaginings. At least from a medical standpoint, the most offensive accusations simply had no factual foundation. After the most stigmatizing and medically unfounded claims are set aside, the question naturally shifts to a more critical level: whether Bruce Lee's body had already shown warning signs prior to July. According to medical records, in May 1973, Bruce Lee experienced a severe medical episode. While working on set, he suddenly began vomiting, subsequently developed convulsions and lost consciousness. He was rushed to hospital in an emergency, and his condition was at one point critical, requiring prolonged resuscitation efforts before he regained consciousness. Subsequent examinations also indicated that he had experienced cerebral swelling. This medical history was not fully conveyed to the emergency room physicians on the night of his death in July, and therefore could not be immediately factored into the assessment of his sudden collapse. In retrospect, however, this episode in May was likely not an isolated incident, but an important warning sign. When the scope is widened further, another dimension gradually comes into view: family medical history. Bruce Lee's father, Lee Hoi-chuen, passed away in his sleep. His elder brother, Peter Lee Chun-chim, was also found deceased at home while in a resting state. Although the three men did not share the same living environments or immediate circumstances, the manner of their deaths bears notable similarities. A single occurrence might be dismissed as coincidence, but when similar circumstances arise repeatedly within the same family, from a medical perspective, they can no longer be regarded as background details that are easily ignored. These clues, within the medical context of the time, may not have been readily connected. Nonetheless, they provide a direction that must be seriously considered when re-examining Bruce Lee's death. At a time when many questions could not be immediately resolved, the investigation did not stop at local autopsy findings alone. Instead, the relevant authorities adopted an approach that was relatively cautious and uncommon for that era, sending selected tissue samples overseas for further independent analysis. According to documents obtained subsequently, tissue samples from Bruce Lee's brain, heart, lungs, liver, and kidneys were sent to New Zealand for examination. After the initial analyses were completed, the results were further forwarded to the United States, including to forensic units associated with the U.S. Navy, for additional confirmation. The focus of the overseas analyses centered on several key areas: whether toxic substances or heavy metals were involved, whether there was evidence of abnormal drug presence or reactions, and whether, at the organ level, there existed any definitive pathology capable of explaining a sudden death. Based on the findings from New Zealand and the subsequent responses from the United States, the reports were unable to confirm poisoning, heavy metal residue, or any drug reaction that could be established as a definitive cause of death. Although small traces of cannabis were detected in some samples, medical literature at the time, and in the years that followed, contained no documented cases demonstrating that cannabis could directly cause fatal central nervous system failure. In other words, these overseas analyses did not support claims of deliberate poisoning or drug-induced death. At the same time, they also failed to identify, at the organ level, any single pathological condition sufficient on its own to explain Bruce Lee's sudden death. Cerebral edema remained a confirmed finding, but its underlying cause could not be fully determined through these analyses. Once poisoning, heavy metals, definitive drug reactions, and visible fatal organ pathology had all been ruled out, the question naturally shifted to another level. In the absence of trauma, intoxication, or a single organ-based cause of death, by what mechanism could a person with a history of severe prior loss of consciousness suddenly die in their sleep? When viewed through the lens of modern medicine, a re-examination of the 1973 autopsy report reveals an important point. The report itself was not incorrect, but rather limited by the medical understanding of its time. When approaching Bruce Lee's death strictly from a medical perspective, the key does not lie in conspiracy, but in the neurological abnormalities that had already appeared during his lifetime. The relevant clues were not assembled retrospectively. As early as the year of his death, these signs existed in fragmented form within medical records and witness testimonies. After his critical illness in May 1973, Bruce Lee returned to the United States and underwent neurological examinations. In the medical reports, physicians used the term convulsive disorder to describe seizure-related neurological dysfunction. and anticonvulsant medication was prescribed. Although no specific diagnosis was confirmed at the time, this already indicated that his neurological system was not entirely normal. On the night of Bruce Lee's death in July, ambulance officer Pang Tak-sang testified at the coroner's court that Raymond Chow, head of Golden Harvest, mentioned in the ambulance that Bruce Lee appeared to have had a seizure. Chow later acknowledged making this remark. In other words, seizure-related neurological issues were already being raised in 1973. When these records are considered together, alongside the convulsions and loss of consciousness in May, his death during sleep in July, and autopsy findings showing no trauma, poisoning, or single fatal organ pathology, and examined through the lens of modern medicine, the medical community now recognizes a clearer category for this pattern of death: sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, or SUDEP. It should be noted that SUDEP itself was not an established medical concept in the 1970s. While isolated discussions linking epilepsy to sudden unexplained death appeared in the 1980s, SUDEP was not formally defined, named, and systematically studied until the 1990s, when it became an accepted category within neurological research. This historical context explains why the term does not appear in medical records or coroner's findings from that period. SUDEP refers to sudden death associated with epilepsy or recurrent seizures, most often occurring during sleep or periods of rest, frequently without witnesses, and without a single, definitive cause identifiable at autopsy. It is not a diagnosis that can be easily confirmed, but an explanatory framework that emerges only after other possibilities have been carefully excluded. It must be emphasized that SUDEP is not presented as a definitive conclusion regarding Bruce Lee's cause of death. Rather, it is currently the only framework capable of addressing multiple established facts simultaneously, grounded in medical evidence and professional analysis. It does not rely on conspiracy theories or stigmatizing speculation, but instead seeks to use today's medical language to interpret a death that could not be fully explained at the time. Bruce Lee's death may never be fully captured by a single, simple answer. But at the very least, we can now say with greater clarity that the most damaging claims circulated over the past half-century have no medical foundation. If you believe Bruce Lee's death deserves a calmer, medically grounded re-examination, consider sharing this video so more people can see evidence rather than rumor. And if you'd like to see more analyses based on records and research, please consider subscribing.